In light of the United States-India summit held in Washington in June, do you think In light of the United States-India summit held in Washington in June, do you think the meeting between President Joe Biden and Indian Prime Minister
Did you know
Narendra
that
Modi
China has been
also
involved
highlights
in
a shift in the global balance of power?
A profound and extensive change is taking place in the world. Let's put it this way. The non-Western parts of the world are experiencing rapid economic growth. I'm talking about countries like India, China, certain parts of Africa, and Latin America, which were poor in the past 2 centuries, but are currently showing significant progress in catching up. If you consider the European Union with a population of around 450 million and the United States with 335 million inhabitants, it accounts for only 10% of the world's population. So the majority of the world, which is still relatively poor, but reducing the gap, lies outside of this.
Seeing this, do you think the United States and the West can accept that there is a certain shift towards developing countries? In fact, it's not just towards developing countries, but towards economic powers such as China or India. Will the West accept that it no longer exclusively wields global influence?
I believe that Europe roughly understands this, although ideas about a European empire still arise occasionally, but these are mostly remnants of the past. In the United States, there is a very strong financial and ideological entity known as the military-industrial complex, which currently does not accept this viewpoint. In my opinion, it represents a significant destabilizing factor in the world. This entity still wants the United States to be dominant over Russia and China. They think that the United States will create an anti-China alliance with India, but this is a very naive and unrealistic notion. I think the majority of the American people are not concerned about whether the United States is the first, second, or fifth largest power in the world because we have so many problems at home. The American people would be completely happy if their government focused on the problems that have accumulated domestically. However, the mentioned military-industrial complex is a strong and dominant player in American foreign policy, which still imagines that the United States is the leading superpower. Furthermore, many European countries, at least currently, subscribe to this idea because many European leaders confuse the European Union with NATO and unfortunately equate them, which is a regrettable mistake. So my answer is that a good and peaceful transition to a truly multipolar world is possible, but there are those who oppose it in the United States.
You mentioned the defense industry, which is a huge economic sector and a source of revenue and profit for the industries involved. This brings us immediately to the issue of the war in Ukraine, in which Russia is the aggressor. Yet the question arises, who benefits from peace and ending this bloody war?
This war broke out because the United States insisted on NATO expanding eastward and pushed for this to happen in Ukraine and Georgia as well. However, Ukraine and Georgia are red lines that cannot be crossed for Russia. Don't do it, the Russians said. The United States, however, was so dismissive, despite the fact that for 3 decades, Russia has been saying, don't dare bring your missiles, bases, and armies to Ukraine, that America thought they were just bluffing. What could Russia do, as it is so weak, and we can do whatever we want? However, President Putin called their bluff. The United States still insists on NATO's presence in Ukraine, and even NATO leaders say they will, of course, expand the organization to Ukraine. Most European leaders, with the exception of Prime Minister Orban, say that NATO will naturally expand to Ukraine. But this is the recipe for endless war and crisis. Thus, the Russian-Ukrainian war was provoked by American aspirations for hegemony. And if we had left Russia alone, had not confronted it with the possibility of NATO expansion in Ukraine, this war would never have broken out.
At the same time, Washington argues that Western military support only serves to assist Ukraine in protecting its sovereignty and territorial integrity. The United States claims to support Ukraine as long as necessary. But where are the hopes for a peace agreement?
There could have been peace in December 2021 when President Putin put a draft agreement on the table with the United States, which was based on Ukraine's neutrality. But Washington rejected it. There could have been peace in April 2022 when Russia and Ukraine negotiated an agreement based on Ukraine's neutrality. The United States rejected that too. The day when the President of the United States, Joe Biden, came out in public and said that Russia must call home its army and the United States will never allow NATO to expand to Ukraine. This could have been the basis for ending the war. But Biden is unwilling to say this because he disagrees. He has been among those who support NATO expansion for 30 years, as does his environment, as do the top brass of the American military, the generals. They do not want peace. They want continuing war until the United States achieves its goal.
I attended a press conference led by John Kirby, the spokesperson for the White House National Security Council, who argued that the Biden administration's approach to foreign policy is one of cooperation. Over the past 2 years, however, we have seen unprecedented political and economic division develop globally. This raises the question, how effective is this cooperative foreign policy? And how successful is it?
In this sense, Biden is a neoconservative, having been part of the aforementioned military-industrial complex throughout his congressional career as vice president and now as president. He doesn't support collaboration with others whom he calls allies and friends. He says that the greatest challenge and basis for division in the world today is the divide between democracies and autocracies. However, this is nonsense. And it's dangerous because the world is not structured that way and it should not be so bifurcated. The world should be unified in order to face common challenges, whether it's in regards to the functioning of the world economy, the preservation of the natural environment, or the ever-increasing uncertainty. And yet we don't do this, but instead try to expand NATO, increase military budgets, and speak aggressively about China. After Secretary of State Blinken's seemingly reasonable and constructive visit to Beijing, the next day, President Biden restarted and called President Xi Jinping a dictator. One wonders what kind of China policy this is. The world does not want this kind of destabilization. It does not need this foreign policy. The United States must contribute to ending the war in Ukraine, understanding that Russia also has legitimate security interests. These must be negotiated also to protect Ukraine and ensure that the security interests of every country are upheld.
What are you going to do is have like 50 wars around the world to discipline the third world? It's not going to happen anymore. I think that period has by and large come to a close. And I think the West has to understand that it's merely a group of countries in the world. Nothing special about the United States. It's just one among the 190 odd countries in the world. They need to realize that it's not a city on a hill. It's just a country. Relax. You're just another country.
Hello, everybody. This is Pascal from Neutrality Studies, and I'm joined today by Vijay Prashad, who is an Indian historian, journalist, and an academic. He was a professor of international studies at Trinity College, Connecticut, and is the author of 40 books, including Red Star Over the Third World and The Darker Nations, A People's History of the Third World. His latest book, The Withdrawal, Iraq, Libya, Afghanistan, and the Fragility of US Power, was written with Noam Chomsky. He currently serves as executive director of the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research. Vijay is a public intellectual, and I consider him, together with people like Noam Chomsky, Yanis Varoufakis, Jeremy Corbyn, as one of the leaders of the global left, who's pointing the finger at where it actually hurts, that colonialism never really ended, and the majority of today's wars are still the outcome of imperial Western politics. And Vijay, you correct me if that is wrong, but that's how I perceive you. So thank you very much for joining me.
Hey, listen, Pascal, it's a pleasure and happy to talk to anybody who's domiciled in Japan. So great to be with you.
Thank you very much. So, Vijay, you've written so much about world politics, and you've especially looked at the third world, and I'm putting it in quotes because the third world, the term itself, comes out of the non-aligned states, right? Who literally wanted to be neither of the two. And where do you see the third world today, and countries that try not to be sucked into this new Cold War that's unfolding in front of our eyes?
You know, we're in a really difficult situation. Just a few days before we are now talking, Pascal, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, released a summary document, which, if you haven't read it, I recommend you not read it because it's really scary. I mean, it's chilling, you know, what they show. That the question of the climate catastrophe is accelerating. That's one problem. Every year, UN agencies such as the UN Development Program, the UN Conference on Trade and Development, even the International Monetary Fund, every year they release reports about growing social inequality in the world, you know, deepening inequality, terrible inequality, billions of people having a hard time finding food every day, not millions, not hundreds of millions, but billions. That's the judgment of the Food and Agriculture Organization, of the UN and the UN's food program, World Food Program, WPF. Given the climate catastrophe, the growing inequality, the despair in the world, you'd think this is a great opportunity for leading powers of the world to come together, you know, to use multilateral institutions like the UN in good faith, attempt to broker a deal, listen to each other's national interests, you know, the insecurities that countries are facing and so on. But in fact, we're going in the opposite direction. We're going in a direction of greater confrontation and less collaboration. Even the pandemic didn't provoke countries to greater collaboration. You know, half the countries on the African continent spent more paying off their debts during the pandemic than they did on healthcare. You'd have thought that at that point, wealthy bondholders would have been told, wait, guys, let's first take care of the pandemic. Your profits come later. And by the way, when Credit Suisse got into trouble, the regulators had no problem telling the wealthy bondholders, we're going to do a haircut. You're going to lose your money. You know, grade A bondholders were basically told, sorry, you get out of the line. We're not going to pay you, you know, and there's going to be some legal repercussions for both the Swiss government and UBS, which has absorbed Credit Suisse. So at a time of a banking crisis, they're okay to tell wealthy bondholders, you're out of the queue. But during the pandemic, they still allowed wealthy bondholders to claim wealth from African countries. Now, given this confrontation, given this lack of concern for the climate catastrophe, for social inequality, and so on, it's no wonder that increasingly countries in the global south, the third world, and so on, are saying, wait a minute, we don't want to line up behind the West, or we don't even want to line up behind Russia or anybody. We want to operate on the basis of our national interests. And if our national interests, for instance, the Indian government, a good test case, if our national interests mean that we're going to continue to trade with Russia during this war, we're going to do it. What can you do about it? You know, this is our national interest. It's not our national interest to sanction Russia at this time. In fact, the government of Japan, very in a similar way, said we're not going to actually slice our energy agreements with the Russian government. The Sakhalin-2 project, for instance, in which Japan has a very large financial stake, it's not cutting that stake. Japan joined the G7 statement condemning Russia for the war in Ukraine, but it didn't cut Sakhalin-2. I noticed that immediately. So what we're seeing is we're seeing countries of different kinds, not only struggling countries, but also OECD countries like Japan, essentially say, look, our national interests are important. We don't want to be sucked into what they see, and I think rightly, as an ideological conflict, you know, a conflict around ideology, around political power. They don't want to damage further their economic situation in order to help maintain the Western countries as the dominant countries in the world. So I think that to a great extent, helps us understand why many countries seem to now be saying, look, I'm not sure I want to really get involved in this conflict like you want me to.
The ideological spin that especially the West put on the current war in Ukraine is tremendous, right? It's again good against evil from the Western perspective, right? Just as it was good against evil when the US had to justify its war in Iraq, just as every single war you fight is always good against evil, right? Otherwise you don't go to war. And neutral countries and non-aligned countries and the third world, they always have the same problem that they need to explain to both of these also publics. And that's what we are doing, right? We are talking to the publics of the US, Europe, Russia, and maybe even China to tell them, look, why you are on neither side. How do you approach that problem? I saw like an interview with the Indian foreign minister a couple of months ago, and it was really difficult for him, really difficult to get the point across to the interviewer that, you know, India is not on the side of evil. It's not on the side of like one or the other. It's just on its own side. Why is that so difficult, and how do you deal with it? Because I believe you must have dealt with that problem over and over, right?
Pascal, I'm really glad you used the word evil. And that's it, because it's such an interesting concept. And I don't want to get too theological about this, but I think we have to enter a worldview, a Weltanschauung, a perspective that exists, which is a worldview that comes out of not maybe all Abrahamic religions, but certainly Christianity. In other words, the idea of evil. I don't, for instance, believe in the idea of evil. I believe in the concept of contradictions. People have very contradictory things. Terrible things happen in the world. They happen for structural reasons. They happen because of individual choices, because people suspend their ethical judgment at crucial moments. But I don't believe in good and evil in an abstract sense. You know, I don't believe, for instance, that the United States government is good and everything it does, therefore, is salvation. You know, over 1 million people killed in Iraq is not salvation. Just because the United States conducted that war, it doesn't get a free pass, in my opinion. At the same time, I don't consider the United States evil because over 1 million people died in Iraq. I think this is the point of understanding the world for its complexity, the contradictions, different power groups that are in power at different times. They have suspension of ethical judgment. They go into a war ruthlessly, kill a lot of people, and so on. In the same way, I don't think all the adversaries of the United States are evil. I mean, look, until 2007, it was the Western countries that built up the reputation of Vladimir Putin. It was Tony Blair who said that, went and visited Mr. Putin, went to the opera with him, made a public comment saying, I vouch for Mr. Putin. It was George W. Bush who said, I looked into his eyes and I see an honest man. It was Thomas Friedman, you know, the great sloganeer of the New York Times, the so-called paper of record of the United States. It was Thomas Friedman who wrote, I'm rooting for Putin. Suddenly, when Mr. Putin goes to the Munich Security Conference in 2007, gives a speech saying, we don't believe there should be a single master in the world. You know, he directly confronts the United States. Suddenly, the press starts to say he's evil, he's a dictator, he's this. In fact, let's stop for a minute with the term dictator. It's interesting that the Western press is now calling Mr. Putin a dictator. Who set up the system in Russia that gave Mr. Putin all those powers? It was Western political scientists, State Department officials, non-governmental officials who went to Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union, who worked to give the presidency enormous powers, because at the time, it was their friend Boris Yeltsin. In fact, they even stole an election for Mr. Yeltsin against Gennady Zyuganov, who seemed to have won an election. And even Time magazine reported that the election was stolen. So, you know, you're now saying the oligarchs in Russia, you produced the system that gave those people the ability to privatize all the assets and so on. It's very interesting how this idea of good and evil is mobilized ideologically, used when it benefits people. I frankly don't believe in the philosophy of good versus evil. I believe the world is much more complicated than that. It's a childish approach to the world, if I may say so, even less than theological.
I agree. I agree with you full-heartedly. My question is, why is it possible for let's call it a free society? I mean, the West has its faults and its mistakes, but one of the things that's good is that we can have these debates, and it is relatively free. But how is it possible in a free society to sell to a majority of people that idea of good against evil, and to break and to make the world that simplistic, while the contradictions are just overwhelming, right? I mean, Saudi Arabia is not exactly a beacon of democracy, and Egypt neither, but they are the closest buddies, right, of Europe and the United States. And we have these huge contradictions, huge, right? At the moment, we are asked to believe that, Russia blew up its own pipeline, or that it's a mystery who did that. They're so glaring, so huge, that I wonder, how is it possible to still get a narrative? And we understand the world in narratives, right? As historians, we understand that very well. How is it possible to still sell that narrative and then control the current 6 weeks of politics, right? That politics is constant continuation of 6 weeks that you need to control, and this control seems to be working, and that's how you get so many people rallied behind the idea only a military victory is a good victory in Ukraine, which is the root of all bloody wars. What's your take?
Yeah, it's really interesting. There's a number of layers. Let's first go to an ideological layer, and then to a kind of sociology of knowledge, if you will. First, the ideology. There is a very much undamaged idea that the West is essentially benevolent. Now, God knows where this comes from, because there's a long history of colonialism, genocide, this, that, and the other. You can never call, say, the United States genocidal. Genocide is always for the barbarian. There is a kind of racist way in which the West is always benevolent, regardless of the history. I mean, Belgium and the Belgian King Leopold could have conducted mass genocides in the Congo, but yet it's the Congolese who will be seen as savages, and the Belgians who will be seen as civilized. Look at what one of the foreign officials of Europe said. He said Europe is a garden and the rest of the world is a jungle. I mean,
Borrell.
for God's sake, man, this is incredible. It's kind of 19th century language. But Europe is a garden, meaning that Europe is benevolent. Europe doesn't do things wrong. I remember reporting the war in Libya, and when NATO command was asked by human rights agencies and the United Nations for evidence that NATO had not committed war crimes, Peter Olsen, who was the lead attorney for NATO, wrote a letter, public letter, in which he said that NATO never commits war crimes. It's just a contradiction in terms to put the words NATO and war crimes in a sentence. In other words, there's an ideology of benevolence. That's the first thing. Then there's a sociology of knowledge. You mentioned Noam Chomsky earlier. Mr. Chomsky is a very old friend of mine. We've done a book together. We talk a lot. Chomsky has never really been in mainstream publications talking politics. He was recently published in the New York Times, not about Ukraine, of which he has studied opinions on, not about that, not about the new Cold War against China or the blockade on Cuba, things in which he has very interesting opinions. No, he was published in the New York Times on his opinions about artificial intelligence. He's permitted to talk about that, but he's not even permitted on National Public Radio, any of these forums, to have a discussion about his ideas. And he complains about this all the time in his own wry way. He has 1 million platforms, but they're all often quite small compared to the mainstream platforms. A major American intellectual, a kind of prophet of the American traditions of justice, is not able to speak to the general public. Well, that's interesting. It speaks to the sociology of knowledge. The same people who promoted the war against Iraq continue to be analysts for every single US foreign policy adventure. They will never get, in a sense, set aside. They will never get delegitimized at all. Indeed, the people who participated in constructing that war George W. Bush, Condoleezza Rice, they're still brought on television in the United States now to talk about their opinions on Ukraine and so on. But of course, people who have a different view are not brought on. And that says a little bit about the sociology of knowledge. Yes, of course, I agree with you. There's a lot of openness. The stormtroopers don't break through your door to prevent us from having a conversation on a podcast. That's fine. But the big players, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journals, the CNNs, and so on, just don't have a great diversity of opinion. Even things like MSNBC, during the campaign of Bernie Sanders, the most liberal television channel, mainstream channel in the United States, never really made any room for Mr. Sanders and his surrogates. He was off limits. Even Sanders was off limits. So there are, in a sense, lines drawn of what is permissible. Now, you can say whatever you want on the street, and that's fine. But there are no real public channels, for mass communication with people. Now, BBC is interesting in the UK because, after all, that's a government supported channel. It's supported by licensing fees of the public. You'd think, well, in BBC, they should have all kinds of opinions. Talk to Jeremy Corbyn. Ask Mr. Corbyn how frequently he is allowed to contribute his opinion. When Gary Lineker was recently junked because of his opinions about refugees, he's the great British football player, England's football player, led them to victories all over the place. Gary Lineker was the presenter of a show on football, but he made some tweets complaining about the British government's refugee policy. He was thrown out by BBC. They suspended his show. And Jeremy Corbyn went out in public and defended Gary Lineker. Well, shouldn't BBC have invited Jeremy in to have a conversation? After all, former Labour leader. Not a chance. When Keir Starmer said that Jeremy Corbyn is not going to be able to run on a Labour ticket in North Islington, BBC didn't call Jeremy into the studio for a discussion. So there are lines, there's a lot of freedom. Jeremy can say whatever he wants on Twitter and so on. But there are lines when it comes to mass communication that's controlled by big corporations and even by governments. In the case of BBC, there are limits to what's permissible. Now, I understand that, people in power have their own limits, but let's not pretend that it's, Karl Popper's open society.
No, you're right. And it was Noam Chomsky who explained to us more than 30 years ago how the sociology of manufacturing consent works and how this is a self-correcting mechanism that then creates these ships, right, that you can steer. So I just we were going through this whole, the internet is going to revolutionize everything and make an open society. And no, it doesn't. We are still living in a world dominated by states and state narratives and state interests, and we are still the propagandized general public who's then asked to hate another general public over there, and the sociology keeps on spinning. But maybe let me ask you, because this spinning of the war narrative seems not to be working in the third world. I mean, Africa, Southeast Asia, East Asia, South America, they are all kind of rejecting this the stupid narrative of good against evil, and they all see things in a more nuanced way and have these self-interests. And my point is, this like a neutral position is not only good for these countries, it can also help to broker some kind of agreement. Do you also see more good coming out of taking a third position, or do you see dangers in that?
Well, firstly, if you go back 20 years, you'll remember that most countries in the third world were very much opposed to the US war on Iraq. Thabo Mbeki, for instance, then president of South Africa, made public statements condemning the lead to war and so on. So did the Indian government, cautioned and said that Indian soil will not be used, they will not allow overflights from Diego Garcia to Iraq and so on. Countries at the time were also uneasy about a US adventure like that. But they didn't have the kind of confidence because they were all sort of in the thrall of globalization at that time. Remember, this is less than 10 years after the World Trade Organization was established. You see, today, 20 years later, things have changed. And I think part of the change has to do with the economic emergence of China, and China actually putting institutional alternatives on the table. For instance, The People's Bank of China offering currency swaps gives a country an option, not necessarily to go straight to the IMF and take a structural adjustment loan, or to go to the London or Paris groups, to the creditors, and raise money through an IMF backed project, a kind of program that the IMF sets. Now they have choices, largely because of the emergence of the Belt and Road project and so on. The fact of the choice available to countries has increased the political space for countries to say, look, I'm not interested. Because you see, when Janet Yellen, the Treasury Secretary of the US, tours Africa and tells countries, you've got to vote with us on Ukraine, or you've got to send weapons to Ukraine, they're going to look at her and say, Madam Secretary, we're not interested. Because now you can't in the back room tell us, if you don't accept what I'm saying politically, we're going to squeeze you on credit. You can't tell us that, because we'll go to the Chinese. There are now alternatives. And I think the reason why you see smaller countries, Namibia, for instance, the prime minister was extremely frank when she spoke at this year's Munich Security Conference. The reason countries can do this now, where they felt slightly less confident 20 years ago, is principally because the economic emergence of China has changed the political dimension. I think the West is completely aware of this and understands this. And, if you're a country like, say, Namibia, and, the Chinese have come and said, look, we're going to invest so many $100 million to build a railroad, to build a hospital, to build whatever. And the United States Embassy says, don't take the deal. The government of Namibia is going to turn to the embassy and say, what's on the table from you? And because of the kind of tax strike in the US, the financialization of the economy, there's simply nothing that the US government can put on the table. The Millennium Challenge Corporation, set up by the Bush administration in 2004 as a contest in a way, it was supposed to be the new Peace Corps or the new Marshall Plan or whatever, is now used as a contest against China. But, we're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars. Antony Blinken was recently in Niger, in the Sahel region, and he promised $150 million to the Sahel for humanitarian. That the Chinese can give you in 15 minutes. They can give you that in cash. They have much more surplus available for investments of different kinds. So this gives countries a lot of confidence, Pascal. They are not living in 2002 anymore. They are now in 2023, when there are these choices before them. And I think that accounts for a lot of the public demurrals. Countries saying, look, I don't want to come out in public on this. It's not in my national interest. Why? Because I don't need to. Firstly, you can't strong arm me. I've got options from China. And also, I would like to let you know that we have also older relations with Russia. I think that's another point to put on the table, which is that many of these countries, particularly in Africa, many of them feel grateful not to Russia, but to the Soviet Union for their assistance during the national liberation movement. And that generation is now in power. And many of them that I've spoken to, heads of major offices on the African continent, finance ministers, foreign ministers, and so on. And in two cases, heads of government, they say openly, look, we are grateful to the Soviet Union for its assistance during our liberation movements in the 1960s and 70s. And now we have old friends in Russia. And that is, by the way, also playing a role, which we shouldn't underestimate. Also plays a role in India, because people may not remember, in 1971, the United States sent the 7th Fleet to threaten India during the Bangladesh Liberation War. And India signed a friendship treaty with the Soviet Union. Even the right-wing government in India today references that event and says that, look, we can't abandon the Russians. They helped us in our time of need.
I am afraid that one of the things the US and the West, including the European Union, is going to take away from this situation will be, we need more interventionism in these countries that are not in line, and we need to put the Namibians back to knowing which road to tie. And I'm afraid that this will that the US, you can see this already, this onslaught against the undecided ones or against the ones who are not with us, right? do you see danger there, or do you think the choice that is now available will make it easier for the third world to navigate the coming the new Cold War?
I mean, look, I don't want to mock the dangers or minimize the dangers. There are dangers, but what I would say to Washington and Paris and so on is good luck. Paris has just faced a strategic defeat in Burkina Faso and Mali, and I think they will find it difficult going in Niger and Benin. Right now, it looks like Niger and Benin are friendly countries. Those governments are sitting on a razor's edge because the populations are looking towards Burkina Faso and Mali and watching the military governments led by young people with a kind of welfarist orientation to the population. These countries are saying to the French, you're not welcome in the Sahel. And these defeats that are being faced by France from small countries, in terms of their power and influence in the world is considerable. So good luck. I mean, good luck to the United States. I don't think that Blinken's 2 visits, he visited Ethiopia and he visited Niger, I don't think those are going to bear fruit. Ethiopia, anyway, has developed a very antipathic relationship to the West as a consequence of the war against the Tigray people and so on. They were developing a very strong anti-imperialist attitude in Ethiopia. And in Niger, as I said, despite the fact that there's a major drone base costing almost $300 million, the US has a big base, Air Base 201 in Agadez. And also the French have a major uranium mine in the town of Arlit, north of Agadez, toward the Libyan border. Good luck controlling all that, my friends, because 2 things are endangering the control of the West in the Sahel, which is a test case for what we're talking about. Can you reverse the tide? 2 things. One is the jihadi element that was awoken by the West's ridiculous war against Libya, which is there knocking on the doors of the French uranium mine in Arlit. And secondly, the fragility of these governments, because the young military officers in their countries are looking at the presidential palace and saying, you guys are corrupt and we're coming for you. And I think these young officers are not willing to break bread with the French or with the Americans. They are not easily bought off. They have different orientations. And so I don't think that whatever the West wants to do, what are you going to do is have like 50 wars around the world to discipline the third world? It's not going to happen anymore. I think that period has by and large come to a close. And I think the West has to understand that it's merely a group of countries in the world. Nothing special about the United States. It's just one among the 190 odd countries in the world. They need to realize that it's not a city on a hill. It's just a country. Relax. You're just another country. Nothing special about you. It's a little bit like Israel. Nothing special about you. You're just another country. Relax. Behave like human beings.
Vijay, you're giving me a lot of hope and a lot of very good vibes. So thank you very much for taking the time to talking to us all.
It's my pleasure, Pascal. Really.
Let's face one thing. There are no conditions for joining NATO. Except for one. The only condition for joining NATO, the only one, is that all NATO allies are prepared to apply, if need be, Article 5. And as I'm arguing right now, certainly, and now this is out in the open and agreed, that can't happen while the current war is going on. There will be no Ukrainian membership before that. And unless Russia does something that so far it hadn't shown a willingness or ability to do, it's not going to happen while the war is going on. And afterwards, we shall see. But I don't believe, again, that all 31 countries will be prepared in the event of a renewal of the war to go to war against Russia. Let's face one thing. There are
Excellencies, I now have the great honor to invite His Excellency Dr. William Ruto, President of the Republic of Kenya, to deliver his statement. Your Excellency.
Thank you very much. Your Excellency Azali Osmani, President of the Union of Comoros and the Chair of Africa Union. Your Excellencies, Heads of State and Government, Your Excellency Mr. Musa Faki Mahamat, the Chairman of the Africa Union Commission, Your Excellency Isufu Mahamadou, Champion of the SCFTA and former President of Niger, Your Excellency Amina Mohammed, Deputy Secretary.
Let's face it.
What are you going to do is have like 50 wars around the world to discipline the third world? It's not going to happen anymore. I think that period has by and large come to a close. And I think the West has to understand that it's merely a group of countries in the world. Nothing special about the United States.
Welcome to my channel. Thank you so much for being here. The BRICS bloc countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, have a financial tool that helps them further their economic agenda. The tool that they're using is the New Development Bank. It is often referred to as the BRICS Bank, and it is headquartered in Shanghai, China. The current president of the New Development Bank is an ex-president of Brazil, Dilma Rousseff. Prior to her appointment to the position in March of this year, the first head of the bank was KV Kamath from India, another BRICS bloc country, of course, and the head of the BRICS bank after Kamath was Marcos Troio from Brazil. So you get the idea. Frankly, it doesn't matter what side of the equation you're on, whether you are based here in the United States, desperately hoping that the value of your savings, your investments, your salary won't drop too much with the United States dollar losing its value. Or if you are outside of the United States, hoping that the BRICS currency, the BRICS partnerships will bring more stability to your country. One thing we know is that the BRICS bloc has become a wake-up call for the world that is increasingly becoming multipolar, and it is bad news for the West. The new development bank consists of 5 founding member countries, the core Brics bloc that were recently joined by the UAE, Egypt, and Bangladesh. In addition to these 8 countries, Uruguay is in the process of joining. Argentina, Iran, and Algeria have formally applied to join the extended Brics Plus bloc. Besides the countries that I just mentioned, many other countries have already expressed interest in joining. Among them are Turkey, Mexico, Indonesia, Argentina, Saudi Arabia, and a number of other African countries. The members of the association have begun to work out the criteria for the group's expansion. They want more countries to join, and they are expected to be prepared within the next 3 months. And this is according to the South African Sherpa to the Brics. 3 months is a relatively short period of time. Here's what Rousseff said in a recent interview. And by the way, I will link the interview below so that if you want to watch it, you are welcome to do so. It is very important for me that the new development bank, the Bank of the Brics, she said, acts as the tool to support the development priorities of the Brics and other developing countries. We're seeing many countries choosing to trade using their own currencies. China and Brazil, for instance, are agreeing to exchange with renminbi and the Brazilian real. At the bank, we have committed to it in our strategy. For the period from 2022 to 2026, the bank has to lend 30% in local currencies. So 30% of our loan book will be financed in the currencies of our member countries. The bank has approved $30 billion in financing so far, so 30% of the amount is in local currencies. The main goal of the Brics Bank is to start building a strong multilateral alternative for the countries of the so-called Global South. In a published map of general strategy, the bank clearly indicates that its goal is to mobilize resources for infrastructure and sustainable development projects in Brics nations and their partners, which would serve to complement existing efforts of multilateral and regional banks for global growth and development. This is actually very clear. The new development bank is essentially an alternative to the World Bank, and its goal is to become the sole provider of funds to build the infrastructure within these countries and to sponsor their development. Increasingly, it will do so without the United States dollar. This is what the strategy clearly says. Evolution into a leading provider of solutions for infrastructure and sustainable development. And it will do so via expanding membership, so more and more countries will find it appealing to join to get assistance to build their economies without fear of being sanctioned or have to implement policies that they may not want to. And in addition to that, through the expansion of non-sovereign local currency operations. At the same time as the Brics bloc is gaining momentum, Christine Lagarde, the head of the European Central Bank, recently shared something that we've known all along. We're witnessing a fragmentation of the global economy into competing blocs, with each bloc trying to pull as much of the rest of the world closer to its respective strategic interests and shared values. And this fragmentation is around 2 blocs led respectively by the 2 largest economies in the world. She also commented that we're likely to see more instability as global supply elasticity declines, and we could see more multipolarity as geopolitical tensions continue to mount, which is something many of us can agree with because we see conflicts only being escalated, and somehow we hear nothing about possible peace talks and at least some type of an agreement. Christine Lagarde also addressed the risks associated with energy trading. If global value chains fragment along geopolitical lines, the increase in the global level of consumer prices could range between around 5% in the short run and roughly 1% in the long run. In recent decade, China has already increased 130-fold its bilateral trade in goods with emerging markets and developing economies, with the country becoming the world's top exporter. Obviously, the more countries want to do business with China, that is also offering substantial investments into their economies, by the way, the more they will want to hold a portion of their central bank reserves denominated in renminbi, and the more partners the Brics Bank will work with. I'd like to take a minute to thank the sponsor of today's video, ExpressVPN. I highly recommend their service. I use it daily for secure online browsing. We have so much of our personal information online these days, so we truly need to make sure that it is protected. Claim 3 full months of free service when you sign up using the link shared in the description below. Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed this video, give it a like and consider sharing it. Make sure that you subscribe to my channel on YouTube and Rumble just in case, and check out my free newsletter available on Substack. I'll see you in my next one tomorrow. Take care.
What a lot of women are realizing.
Welcome to my channel. Thank you so much for being here. The BRICS bloc countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa.
The U.S. is weakening dollar hegemony. And in fact, the current Secretary of the Treasury, Janet Yellen, admitted the same thing in an interview recently with Fareed Zakaria on CNN. She also admitted the fact that by imposing sanctions on so many countries, it's
Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa form the intergovernmental organisation known as BRICS, which is one of the most powerful economic groups in the world and one that a lot of people have never even heard of. While not the most flattering name, the BRICS control 26.7% of the world's surface area, 41.5% of the global population, and around a quarter of the world's total economic output, with a combined GDP of $25 trillion. That makes this group larger by every metric than the USA or the EU, and they're only becoming larger as time goes on. The BRICS members have announced plans to trade between each other more intensely. They've even spoken about introducing a common currency that could effectively shut out the West's control over this major group of trading nations. That could be a concerning trend, because obviously these countries don't have the best political relationship with the rest of the world. Russia is currently fighting a war that has been universally criticised by the USA and its allies, and China has made its intentions clear that it wants to invade Taiwan and bring it under direct control of the mainland. Continued economic cooperation has been one of the best deterrents for this kind of conflict over recent decades, and failing that, economic sanctions are a powerful tool that doesn't actively involve getting caught up in an armed conflict between major nuclear superpowers, which most BRICS members are. If these countries can form a trading bloc, or a trading brick, I guess, then not only could countries like the USA lose out on a lot of the global trade, which has been one of the key drivers of its economic growth over the past century, it could also mean that one of the economic trade-offs of military aggression will disappear, and there would be less standing in the way of these countries doing what they want. Of course, this is a worst-case scenario, but even if this group does only use its relationship to foster trade agreements, given its size and influence, it could still radically reshape the global economy. If nothing else, it's a really interesting case study into the dynamics of global economic cooperation, because one thing to remember about this group is that a lot of them don't even like each other. So, what is the economic goal of the BRICS group? Does it pose a threat to the countries not included in this group? And finally, is it likely to succeed? After all of that, to give us a sense of perspective on this group, we can put the BRICS on the Economics Explained national leaderboard to see how they stack up against other economies as well as their own members individually. The BRICS economies were originally grouped as a matter of convenience by economists that wanted to talk about the major developing nations in the world. It wasn't an official organisation like NATO or the European Union, it was just an easy way to refer to major developing economies. There are similar groups that economists make all the time. Tiger economies were used to broadly describe the group of Asian economies undergoing rapid economic growth, originally South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, and Hong Kong. Economists do this with other stuff as well. They will refer to the US dollar as the global reserve currency, but there are no formal agreements or official rules to say that the US dollar is the world reserve. Countries do use other currencies for trade all the time, it's just that they use the US dollar the most because it's the easiest to work with and the most widely accepted. The difference here is that the BRICS countries, or originally just the BRIC countries because South Africa wasn't included yet, saw this grouping and thought to themselves that, hey, yeah, that's actually a good idea, we should team up. The first real mention of the BRICS group was in the early 2000s, but it wasn't until 2009 that the countries involved had their first formal summit in Russia, where leaders from the four nations met to discuss the global economic situation, reforming financial institutions, remembering that this was taking place just after the 2008 global financial crisis, and they talked about how their countries could better cooperate in the future. A month after the first summit, the BRIC nations announced the need for a new global reserve currency that was stable and predictable. Their announcement never directly mentioned the US dollar, but each of the individual countries had been critical of its dominance in the past. A year later, South Africa, a country that was also at the time developing quickly, joined the group, and the country started arranging annual summits to discuss various economic objectives. One of the biggest projects rolled out since the group's formation was the establishment of the New Development Bank, most commonly known as the Brics Bank. This is an organisation, a lot like the International Monetary Fund, which makes investments into developing economies to grow their economic output and hopefully, long-term, make them value-adding participants in global trade, which should, all other things being equal, make every country better off. Membership in the BRICS Bank is a lot more limited than membership in the IMF, which is basically made up of every country on Earth, apart from Cuba, North Korea, Monaco, Vatican City, Liechtenstein, and finally Taiwan, because mainland China won't let that happen. The BRICS nations also discussed plans to build out their own undersea optical fibre cables to link all of the member countries directly. This isn't such a big deal for Russia, China, India, and even South Africa, since they are all relatively close geographically, but it is a bit more of a challenge for Brazil, which is on the other side of the world and cut off from direct ocean access without going around the tip of South America, which is a big project. The countries have even pushed for the BRICS Games, which are kind of like the Olympics or Commonwealth Games, but only open to BRICS members. The general trend of this organisation is clear. They want their own Olympics, their own cable, their own IMF, and their own reserve currency. For the rest of the world, this kind of looks like assembling the Avengers of terrible human rights records. These countries wanting an alternative to existing global operations is an understandably concerning trend. The group is also open to more members as well. The UAE, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Egypt, Bahrain, Argentina, and Algeria have all formally applied for membership. A long list of other countries have also informally expressed their interest. Iran, Algeria, and Argentina formally applied after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which sends a pretty strong message that two distinct economic teams have been formed around the globe. But in the interest of fair analysis, it's important to ask why they want to do this. Sometimes it's important to play devil's advocate on some of these global economic issues, and that's exactly what we're going to do here. All of these developments, in the broader context of moving away from dependency on the rest of the world, and specifically the West, and probably more specifically the USA, raises an obvious question. Why? Why do these countries want to be outside of the influence of everybody else? The obvious conclusion that people would jump to is that they want to be immune from sanctions and other economic tools that the West can use against them if they carry out their less popular geopolitical ambitions. If these guys can trade amongst themselves, they can get access to all of the shared resources and manpower of a massive economic group. So even if they are totally isolated from everyone else, it won't matter because between these countries, they have almost all of the economic factors they could ever need. Now, it's certainly irresponsible to totally disregard that conclusion, but it's also not entirely fair. If the USA or Europe was totally dependent on using China's currency as a medium of exchange or reserve assets, they would probably want their own alternative as well. The demonstration of Russia being cut off from global payments networks showed a lot of countries that their reserves could be rendered useless if they did something that one country didn't like. Now, of course, invading a sovereign nation is not something that any country is going to do by accident, but if it can happen to Russia, there's nothing to guarantee that it won't happen to anybody else, and any responsible government would want to make sure that they have some kind of redundancy in place. As for things like undersea cables directly connecting all the BRICS countries, that was primarily motivated by the revelation that the US National Security Agency was intercepting data that flowed through US territory. Again, it's fair enough that these countries would want to invest in communications channels that were private. Finally, the BRICS Bank, or the New Development Bank, is an alternative to the IMF controlled by the BRICS countries as well as Bangladesh, Egypt, the UAE, and Uruguay. People already don't like the IMF, and there is some understandable animosity towards these member countries, but the New Development Bank is nothing unique. There are dozens of organisations like this around the world that do similar things to the IMF, just targeted at a specific region or cultural group. As an economic entity, the BRICS countries also might look really scary and powerful, but it's basically all China. China accounts for more output than all of the other countries in this group combined, twice over. So the BRICS as a potentially hostile economic force is not that much more concerning than just China alone. Also, while the group has only officially existed for 14 years, it hasn't been very effective in getting much done. The Chinese RMB, which would be the default choice for a reserve currency between the group, is still only 2.7% of global reserves, similar to the reserves of Canadian and Australian dollars. The other currencies of this group are just lumped in by the IMF into the 3.4% of all other currencies kept in reserve. The countries have announced plans to introduce an entirely new currency, with rumours that it could even be backed by gold. But they've been talking about this since 2009, and so far, not much has happened. Even if they did manage to introduce this new currency, it would probably only add rigidities and complications to just trading in their existing currencies. The ineffectiveness of this group to really drive any significant change is also indicative of just the general effectiveness of this group. The Brics economies are failing economies. When the term Brics was first popularised, the countries that made up the group were all growing rapidly and developing advanced industries. There was the genuine expectation from most economists that this group would control the balance of the global economy by now. Of course, they are collectively still very powerful, even without China, not only from a purely economic point of view, but also simply because of the resources, manpower, and technologies they possess, nuclear weaponry being a big one. But most of the countries have slowed down significantly. Russia's growth has been stagnant for over a decade before this latest round of sanctions, and after its invasion of Ukraine, it's only going to fall further. Brazil has lost close to half of its economic output in the last 10 years, and its recovery from COVID is proving to be slow due to ongoing political issues. South Africa has been much the same, having seen no real economic growth in the past decade. And even China, the once seemingly unstoppable economic force, is facing more and more problems as its economy matures. The outlook is not as optimistic as it once was for these countries, even while the world as a whole has grown significantly. These countries are going to have trouble pulling the strings of the global economy if they can't even manage their own. And the group dynamic isn't going to help them either. All of the Brics countries and the potential members of this group are far from what you would call close allies. China and India, the largest economies in this group, have literally had military confrontations along disputed borders. The group is really an alliance of convenience. The smaller members wanted to be part of big economic initiatives, and the largest member liked the control it would give them over major economies around the world. As newer initiatives have conflicted with the goals of the Brics, it's pretty consistently been the Brics initiatives that have not been prioritised. Now, we don't want to entirely discount the potential impact that this group could have on the global economy, but this is really not much more than a loose grouping that meets up once a year to discuss economic objectives. The only reason it gets any attention over the dozens of other similar organisations is because of who the members are. But that doesn't mean that it's not a concerning trend, it's just for a different reason, and that's the fracturing of global cooperation. As groups like this form and the world becomes more insular, only trading and sharing information and resources amongst small blocks with similar interests, we will all struggle. Global trade and global output are almost perfectly correlated, and the reason that countries like the ones in the Brics group were able to develop their economies so quickly is because they had access to the global economy. Building an economy from the ground up is very difficult when you have to do everything from scratch. It's still very difficult now, but it's a lot easier when foreign investors can come in and give countries access to modern technology and infrastructure, and then be a customer for their outputs while they develop their domestic markets. We have already covered this process in a lot of our recent videos, so as always, I don't want to repeat too much here, but the trend of countries becoming more self-sufficient for whatever reason will make this all much more difficult, and long-term, that will slow down global economic growth. Brics are not the only group pushing this. The global pandemic and escalating trade tensions means that most countries and companies are looking to onshore and simplify supply chains where possible, but redundancy often comes at the expense of efficiency and opportunity. India is one of the most promising economies in the world today because of its huge population of relatively well-educated and English-speaking people that can provide skilled offshore services in the international language of business. Getting grouped into an organisation directly opposed to some of its biggest potential customers could hurt its future growth and the growth of the economies that would have benefited from those services. It's not realistic to think that all countries will get along all the time, but economic cooperation has been one of the greatest tools for global peace in the last century. Anything that wants to reverse that trend should be cause for concern, even if the intentions of the group themselves are totally innocent. Okay, now it's time to put Brics on the Economics Explained national leaderboard. Even though they are not a single nation, or even a tightly bound economic union like the EU, ranking them against other economies should give us all a sense of how big of a threat the Brics really are. Starting as always with size, The BRICS have a combined GDP of 25 trillion US dollars, which makes them larger than the EU and even the USA by some margin. The group without China has an output of 7.5 trillion US dollars, but collectively they get a clear 10 out of 10. That GDP, though, is spread out over nearly half of the world's population, which means that despite their impressive collective size, the average resident of a BRICS country only produces $7,800 in output every year, which is significantly behind the global average. This average is brought down primarily by India, which is the most populous and poorest country in the group, but the group as a whole can only get a 4 out of 10. Stability and confidence is not great, not within the group or outside of the group. Russia has been widely sanctioned, Brazil is in the midst of a political and economic crisis, China is fighting trade wars, and India is fighting with China. As a group, they do have some advantages with having each other to rely on for resources and trade, but they still can't get more than a 5 out of 10. Growth has been very strong, thanks again largely to China, but also assisted by India, that more than makes up for the turbulence in the other economies. But because we are looking at this group as a whole, they still get a 9 out of 10. Industry is very strong for these countries. China is the workshop of the world, Russia and Brazil are rich in natural resources, and India has the largest workforce in the world. South Africa is also there. All jokes aside though, it would be unfair to give the group anything other than a 10 out of 10. Altogether, that gives the BRICS an average score of 7.6 out of 10, which shows that on average, they are better together based on these totally arbitrary measurements. Thanks for watching, mate. Bye.
The BRICS alliance, which consists of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, is meeting in August in South Africa. And very high on the agenda is the creation of a new joint BRICS currency. Now, reportedly, the currency will be backed by commodities like gold, oil, and rare earths. And this idea is garnering much interest, with 20 nations applying to join the BRICS, including Saudi Arabia. And this all comes at a time as the trend to de-dollarize is accelerating. In 2001, 73% of global reserves were in dollars. That is now down to 58%. Meanwhile, several countries are formalizing bilateral trade agreements not using the dollar. China and Brazil, South America's biggest economy, have reached a deal to trade in their own currencies, ditching the US dollar as an intermediary. Argentina is paying for Chinese imports in yuan. India and Malaysia now use the rupee to settle trade. India has been buying oil in rubles, rupees, and dirham, and these are just some recent examples of the trend to trade not using the greenback. And the trend has hastened since Russia's invasion of Ukraine last year, with what many have called the weaponization of the dollar, including banning Moscow from the international SWIFT system. Well, my next guest sees this de-dollarization trend continuing and accelerating. He sees the war escalating significantly over the coming months, ultimately culminating in a global depression by 2025, creating the perfect opportunity for the new BRICS currency. Simon Hunt is the founder of Simon Hunt Strategic Services, which provides geopolitical and financial consulting. He has over 50 years of experience in commodities and finance and currently serves on the board of directors of Great Eastern Gold. Simon, it is great to have you with us. Welcome to Kitco.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
It is a pleasure. And as we just discussed, it's very early in the morning where you are, so we certainly appreciate you taking the time. And Simon, we want to start off by really unpacking this whole idea of the BRICS currency. Now, the term BRIC was coined by Goldman Sachs economist Jim O'Neill back in 2001 to describe the rise of Brazil, Russia, India, and China. They had their first summit in 2009 in Russia, and then South Africa joined in 2010, making it BRICS. Now they account for more than 40% of the world's population and about 26% of the global economy, and at least 20 other countries want to join in. How seriously, Simon, should we be taking this idea of theirs to launch a new currency?
I think it's a very serious attack on the dollar world that has existed since World War II. What has created this new growing organization is frustration with the way that America has used the dollar for its own purposes. And what BRICS is really all about is the development of a multipolar world instead of the world being dominated essentially by one country. And it's that growing frustration that is leading to so many other countries wanting to join BRICS Plus. How the new currency will evolve is obviously a pretty closely guarded secret between the Sherpas of the BRICS Plus, who are organizing the meeting in the end of 22nd to 24th of August. I think that there will be a lot of discussion. I think a roadmap has been planned. How much will be announced at the BRICS meeting is questionable. It clearly requires an awful lot of work to see that whatever is the new currency, how it will work. So we will probably see hints of what they are going to do. Now, the original idea was to link the currency to a basket of commodities that BRICS produces. I think that has evolved into whatever is the currency will be convertible into gold. Now, it can either be using the renminbi to be convertible, which actually it is now. You can receive renminbi and you can convert the renminbi into gold through the Shanghai Gold Exchange, which since its inception has actually had a total of something like 25,000 tons moved through the exchange. An interesting aspect of this is how Russia and China treat their growing trade between the two countries. For instance, Russia is currently having a trade surplus of $23 billion odd. Those dollars are held in a gold convertible account in China's central bank, the PBOC. I suspect, without knowing, that will be the template between China and the Gulf countries. What is also happening, as you mentioned, is that BRICS is using local currencies to settle trade balances. And that's being done through the BRICS bank, which is called the New Trade Bank. And they are building a reserve of local currencies, BRICS currencies. For instance, quite recently, they issued in the China bond market $1.2 trillion worth of panda bonds. So you can see that there's a very strong chosen path by BRICS to develop a new mechanism which will be against G7 countries. What people don't appreciate is the depth that BRICS has created in its secretariat. They have special secretariats for every single part of the world, whether it be geopolitics, whether trade, finance, education, and even sports. Each one has its separate secretariat, which is actually housed in the Brics Tower in Pudong in Shanghai. So this is really the early developments of a new block of countries that really is a danger to the G7.
All right, Simon, a lot to unpack there, but I have to start off by focusing on the point where you said that you expect this currency to be convertible into gold. Is that to say that when this currency is launched, whoever holds it can take that and redeem it for physical gold? Is that what you mean by convertible, or is it just an idea that this will be backed by gold, but not necessarily redeemable?
I think eventually, I suspect, because I don't know, it will be a step-by-step approach. I think at the end of say, in the mid-2020s, which is only a few years away, it will be convertible into gold. And what people don't...
I mean, we're in 2023.
I know. Mid to late 2020s, this will happen. What people don't appreciate, or some don't, is the size of the gold reserves which China has and Russia has. China has in total 50,000 tons plus, and Russia probably north of 12,000 tons. So their central banks are only holding a small part of the total. As I mentioned earlier, since the inception of the Shanghai Gold Exchange, something like 25,000 tons has passed through the exchange into Chinese households and institutions. The remaining 25-odd thousand tons, most of that is held by different ministries, including the PLA.
So you're suggesting a full-on return to the gold standard, perhaps even more acutely than it was before, if you expect this currency to be convertible into gold. I'm assuming not on a one-to-one basis, clearly.
I think that's what we will eventually see.
A full-on return to the gold standard.
I think that will probably happen before 2030 by countries who are now and will be members of BRICS Plus.
So to be clear, if somebody holds this new BRICS currency, they can go and exchange it for gold from the countries issuing it, not?
Eventually, yes. As I said, I think it'll be a step-by-step approach.
Do you see other commodities being involved here? Because reportedly, the thinking has been that this would be a currency backed by a basket of commodities representing the natural resources of the various members, for example, oil or rare earths.
That was the original idea, but I think it's now evolved into being a gold-backed currency.
Well, what would that mean for the ability of these countries to issue currencies? I mean, that would seriously curtail that ability.
No. Well, that's a very good question, and it's a complicated answer. The first thing to note is that the Russian economist who is heading up the team to develop this new currency, in an interview he gave the end of last year to a Moscow-based newspaper, laid out a very important point. Whether it's pursued or not, I don't know, but he made the point that any existing member or new member who defaults on loans to Western banks and financial institutions will not be debarred from joining BRICS. So that is a very, very important point if they pursue it.
That would mean that all the debt that these countries owe the IMF, the US, the World Bank essentially gets wiped out when they launch this currency, is what you're saying.
So that's the first point. The second point is the BRICS Bank will eventually grow into being the BRICS World Bank. So a country like Zambia needs loans to continue to develop its mining industry. That's where they will go, not to a World Bank or Western banks.
Okay. How quickly do you see the membership expanding? Because we do know that around 20 countries are applying to join. Ethiopia making its application just today, I believe. Not that that's a significant economic player, but yet another one wanting to join the BRICS coalition. As it stands at the moment, it's still Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, Saudi Arabia, most likely to be the next that would be included, from my understanding. How quickly do you see this coalition expanding?
First of all, you have to remember that it requires the unanimous approval of all BRICS members to accept a new member. So I suspect that the first round of new members will be completed within a couple of years.
And who's most likely, which countries are most likely to be in that first round of expansion?
The Gulf countries. Don't forget that in December last year, President Xi gave a very important presentation to Gulf leaders. So I'm paraphrasing what he said. You will have surpluses with us. We will have deficits with you. We will have surpluses with you, and you will have deficits. How we resolve those differences will be through an interstate means. The message is laid out very clearly. He also said, we will be invoicing everything in RMB. So that also implies either you will hold your RMBs in our bond market, or you will have the means to convert that into gold.
But the new currency is not going to be RMB, renminbis, or yuan. I am assuming it will be some neutral currency.
That's still an open question.
Right. And I understand it's purely, well, mostly speculation in terms of the details, because none of this has been made official in terms of the mechanisms, the details, just putting together the bits of data that we have from reports. What is official is that they are looking at launching a currency. That much we know.
Correct.
Yeah.
And she made that very clear to the Gulf leaders, and the Gulf leaders accepted it. Don't forget that both Saudi Arabia and the UAE have sold parcels of oil and UAE parcels of gas to China, received RMB, and then used, so one is told, used the Shanghai Gold Exchange to convert the RMB into gold. So one suspects these were just test parcels.
And do you see all of these countries adopting this currency as their domestic currency, or just using it to facilitate global trade?
Good question. Again, I suspect it's a step-by-step approach. That the first step is to use it to financing trade between each other. What it also means is that so much of the energy market is going to no longer be in dollars, but in other currencies. Why should central banks hold dollars? So any country that's part of BRICS, they don't need to hold dollars. Other central banks will look around and say, how much of our reserves should we hold in dollars? It won't be the same percentage. Then we have to look at what's a very important point, is how is America going to react to all of this? And that actually, you can link that into what's going on in Ukraine.
Before we get there, Simon, I just want to elaborate more on the idea of oil being priced in another currency, because just a reminder to our viewers is that part of what keeps the dollar as the global reserve currency is its status as the petrodollar, the way that oil is denominated using dollars. Most oil transactions worldwide are conducted in dollars, and this dates back to a pact signed